The breeze at dawn has secrets to tell you. Don't go back to sleep. You must ask for what you really want. Don't go back to sleep. People are going back and forth across the windows, across the door sill, where the two worlds touch. People are going back and forth across the door sill, where the two worlds touch. The door is round and open. Don't go back to sleep. That's Rumi, the 13th century ecstatic poet, mystic, translated by Coleman Barks. You know, I feel like I have lived a lifetime in Persia at some point, maybe around the time that Rumi was there, 13th century. Because when I hear his poetry, it's like, it's not a expert, it's not a teacher. Teacher, yes, but it feels like kin. There's a kinship there. And as many of you know, I grew up in India, and we have a very large Muslim community there. And there is this idea, and they speak Urdu. Urdu is their primary language, which is very close to Farsi. Farsi is the language in which Rumi wrote. So I can't read Urdu, but I understand it quite well, just because it was in the air. And there's a word that they use both in Urdu and in Farsi, and it's called ada. And it's a word that's almost impossible to fully translate into English. People have tried to translate it, and they call it grace, elegance, style, charm, manner. But none of them really do justice to this ada. Ada is like it's more like a sensibility. It's like something that gestures, that sways. Like one of the adas is called Lucknowi ada. Lucknow is one of the cities which has a very old Muslim population that are most of them are Sufi, of Sufi persuasion, and they have this thing of pehle aap, like that's almost a joke. Like you can't cross the street in Lucknow because everybody's saying you go first, you go first. But that's the ada. That's that gesture that Rumi brings so beautifully. And we also, when we read Rumi, one of the things that I also want to remind us is that they're not really poems. They're meant to be sung, they're meant to be danced to, they're meant to be swayed to. So there's the whole body is engaged in the prayer. It's not just the mind, it's not just the words. But we do what we can do with what we got. So I bring him to you today as a friend, really. And I want to bring to you another person who's sort of been in my psyche lately. And this is somebody I have actually met. And his name is Mallikarjun Mansoor. He was a classical, North Indian classical vocalist, Hindustani classical vocalist, who lived until the 1990s. And the reason why I bring him to you is partly because I had a dream about maybe a month or so ago. And in the dream, I was in London for one night, and I was just going to visit London because my daughter lives there and I was going to visit in a few days. So I'm not surprised that London showed up in my dream, but in the dream, I was in London for one day, and I was going to a concert. It was in a tiny space, in a tiny concert hall, and Mallikarjun Mansoor, this person, was supposed to perform. I go in there a little early, and there's a bed made up where the performance should be a large bed. You know, if you have seen the movie Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, you remember the grandparents on that large bed? That reminded me of that, like on both sides. And there was a man and a woman. They were not embracing, there was nothing sexual about it. They were far separated. But it felt like they were very familiar to waiting. They were waiting. And the man I immediately identified as the tabla accompanist. So tabla is the percussion instrument that you use in India. So he was the tabla accompanist of Mallikarjun Mansur. I recognized him in the dream. But then it turns out that this younger woman, she's about my age. So Mallikarjun Mansur, when I met him, was in his 80s. This young woman, she is Mallikarjun Mansur in the dream. And they've been just lying in this bed waiting. And then the percussionist, the tabalchi, asks me, so you know you are introducing us tonight. I'm like, what? So in the dream, I'm very confused because I don't even know this Mallikarjun. It's a woman, it's young, she's younger, like, what am I going to say? And then a lot of things happen, as happen in dreams. But even after I woke up, like this dream kept nudging me, like there's something here. And I didn't know what it was. And as I kind of sat with it, one of the things that I felt was maybe I should bring Mallikarjun to this community. Maybe that's the introduction that the dream was asking. Because in some ways, Mallikarjun, he's from a different culture, a different time, but I think in some ways he and Rumi are bringing something very similar, and that has to do with what's forbidden, allowing what's forbidden. So let's talk about Rumi first. And I'm sure a lot of you know Rumi, love Rumi. So you know Rumi was a scholar, a respected theologian, he was a teacher, he had his own madrasa, his own school, students, he was married, had sons, like a person who's well settled, respected, knew what belongs, what doesn't belong. His world was ordered. And into that came this wild dervish, Shams. Shams from the... He was this wild man. Some people say he was unlettered. And he belonged to no school, no lineage, no respectable institution. He was not invited by anybody. He did not knock politely. He arrived in the middle of... There are many, many stories, but some say that Rumi was walking in the garden with his students and this wild man comes in and asks him a question that cracks Rumi open. To the point that he abandons his students, his books, his structured life. He and Shams go into a room, and again, there are different versions of the story, but some stories say they remain there shut for 40 days, talking. No one knows what they talked about. But during those 40 days, the students did not have access to him. The family did not have access to him. Everybody was worried. People were thinking, like, how do we get this guy out? Because he's messing up our nice, ordered world. And of course, at the end of it, when Shams and Rumi finally came out, Rumi was no longer the old Rumi. Rumi became Rumi. Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. Rumi just means from Rome, from Rum. So it's just a honorific. But I want us to kind of really feel into what Rumi did. Because this man Shams, he had been an outsider. He was a wild dervish. And you couldn't have a 15-minute conversation and then go for tea. You needed the time for this energy to settle into the room enough, and for Rumi to be empty enough to actually hear what Shams had to say. And a lot of people believe, and with good reason, that it was that interaction with Shams that cracked open the scholar and released the poet. So he was the forbidden one. And Rumi speaks about this. All his later writing is about this moment. And one of the poems that I love, that's again being translated into English by Coleman Barks. It does justice to the poem in some ways, but it's still a little bit limiting. But here are Coleman Barks' words from this poem. It's called the Reed Flute Song. Since I was cut from the reed bed, I have made this crying sound. Anyone apart from someone he loves understands what I say. Anyone pulled from a source longs to go back. What was Rumi talking about? One way to think about it is he was pulled away from his organized life, his livelihood, his respectability. It could also be that until Shams came, Rumi was actually separated, divorced from his true inheritance, which is this poetry that lived in him. Or maybe it was about Allah, because he taught about Allah, he spoke about Allah, he lectured about Allah, but maybe he didn't love Allah the way he could after Shams came. So anyone pulled from a source longs to go back, and very often you can't go back. When we encounter the forbidden, something fundamentally transforms in us, and we're not the same person any longer. And of course, we will never know, because you cannot do a control experiment of Rumi plus Shams, Rumi minus Shams. But those words that came out of Rumi after that encounter are still coming to these congregations, to people's homes 400 years later. It's extraordinary. So that's a story about what happens when you allow the forbidden in, against all practical wisdom. And then I want to tell you about Mallikarjun Mansur, the dream that prompted this whole thing. But before I do that, I want to tell you two things just to kind of situate the story so you can fully appreciate it. The first thing is in the North Indian classical and also in South Indian. So North Indian classical, we call it Hindustani, and South Indian classical, we call it Carnatic classical. But in both of them, the music is in the form of ragas. And ragas are this particular set of, they have their own scales, they have their own melody, they have certain notes that are allowed or even emphasized, and certain notes that are forbidden. So there are certain ragas where you cannot use certain notes. And so if you are singing a raga that has a forbidden note, to sing it is not just a mistake, it's a transgression. You are breaking something holy, something sacred. And each of these ragas, each of these notes have personality. They have names. So each of the notes have names, their personalities, they're sometimes seen as gods or gandharvas, and they are associated with particular moods, particular times of the day, particular seasons. So they're fully embodied beings. And in this climate, so Mallikarjun was born in 1910 in a small village in Karnataka called Dharwad on a new moon night, Amavasya. And he had this beautiful voice as a young boy, and there was this traveling theater troupe called Yakshagana. They picked him up because of his voice, and then a Carnatic master noticed him and took him under his tutelage. And then he went to a Hindustani teacher, and eventually went under the tutelage of somebody called Alladia Khan, who was a very, very well-known both musician and teacher. He had his own school called Gharana, and this was the Jaipur Atrauli Gharana. Then he passed him on to his sons, one son, then the other son. So bottom line is Mallikarjun was trained in many, many lineages. He did not come from one lineage, did not come from one household. And as a result, his singing was unique. He was very different from a person who's been brought up in one lineage, one kind of school of singing, where it's very specific. He had influences from many. And as a result, he became known for something very specific. First, his singing style was unique because he is both Carnatic and Hindustani, and also some of this theater experience as a young boy. And his life's work became working with or bringing back what are called aprachalit ragas, which means ragas that are uncommon, that are not in circulation, that are rare. And of course, the reason why they're rare could be many things, like somebody lost the thread, the school lost the thread, and or somebody thought this was not important enough, or it was too close to a common raga, some reason that this was no longer being practiced. And so Mallikarjun's life's work became bringing back these and singing them to people. And kind of bringing them back in conversation. And again, if we go back to Rumi, in the reed flute poem, he says, "At any gathering I'm there, mingling in the laughing and grieving, a friend to each, but few will hear the secrets hidden within the notes. No ears for that." Mallikarjun had the ears. He could hear those ones in the margin, those ones at the wings. And in fact, he wrote, he co-wrote a biography, autobiography later in his life, and he calls it Rasa Yatra. So his entire life as a traveling song looking for the essence. So that's that. So now I want to tell you the story. So this was all preamble. So the story is, it was 1992. I was a graduate student in Hyderabad in India, and I was part of this classical music club. And we used to invite artists. And we heard that Mallikarjun was coming. And we were surprised and excited and a little worried because he had been very, very ill for a long period of time. He hadn't sung for years. And there was rumor that he was physically ill, but also something had happened to his mind. Like he was in an asylum, or there were no real words to catch what was happening, but something had happened to him. And then he was in coma, and people thought he was going to die. Came out of coma in April of 1992. He died in September. So just a few months. And he was 81 years old at that time. And during that time, he gave only 2 or 3 concerts, and ours was one of them. So it's extraordinary, right? So it was I think it was a Sunday morning, actually, like about this time. And so we're in this auditorium, and Mallikarjun comes, sits on the stage, just himself and an accompanist. And he starts to sing, and he stops. And he starts to sing again, and he stops. Starts to sing again, and he stops. And everybody's starting to get worried, like maybe he's just too ill, he can't sing. And you can see like he's struggling. And then he asks for a break. Can I have a little time? So people say, of course. So he goes away, about 20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, and then he comes back. And when he comes back, he is literally glowing. Like he's transformed. And he sits down and he tells us a story. He says, you know, this raga that I have been singing, it had 2 forbidden notes, Gandhar and Nishad. So the 3rd and the 7th of the 7-note scale. And he said, from the very beginning, Gandhar and Nishad have been waiting in the wings, and they wanted to come in. And I have been telling them, you can't come in, you're not allowed. And they wouldn't listen to me. They were jostling at the wings, and I just couldn't concentrate on singing because they wanted my attention. So I had to do something. I had to talk to them. And he spoke about it as if that's the most normal thing that you would do. So he took the 20 minutes and he went and spoke with them. And they came to an agreement, and the agreement was they could come in at the time of their choosing. And then he sang. And I cannot tell you what the music was like because there are no words for it. But when he finished, there was no applause. There was pin drop silence in the room. And everybody just stood up. Like the audience was all crying. He was crying. And we had witnessed something that was not ordinary. This was a master who had broken a rule for the in greater service to these ragas, these notes, these beings that he knew so well. And I mean, I have been at many, many concerts. I've been moved by many musicians, but this was something that I would call transcendental. Like, it was not an experience that was of this world, or not completely. Something happened, some energies broke into the room that day. And that is because Mallikarjun had the power and the tenacity and the training and the experience and the practice of 80 years or whatever, 70 years, that he could say, this is a rule that I want to break because it is worth breaking. It is worth bringing those forbidden notes into this raga at this time because they want to, and they know better than I do. So 40 years for Rumi, 20 minutes for Mallikarjun. What will it be for us? Each one of us. Rumi reminds us the reed flute is fire, not wind. Be that empty. I'll read that again. The reed flute is fire, not wind. Be that empty. And we had a teacher, a Sufi teacher, who taught us how the flute is made. Because once it's cut from the reed bed, you actually pour molten metal through it to burn down everything so it becomes truly hollow. That is the fire. Are we going to allow that fire? Are we going to allow the molten metal to be passed through us? Rumi says, stay where you are inside such a pure, hollow note. What is the hollow place in us? In our personal lives, in our congregational life, what is that hollow note? And if we really stay there, what might enter? What might we allow? Rumi says, today, like every other day, we wake up empty and frightened. Don't open the door to the study and begin reading. Take down the dulcimer, the musical instrument. Let the beauty we love be what we do. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. So these are two masters separated by many centuries, tradition, language, geography, but they're teaching us the same thing. Allow what you thought was forbidden and see what happens. So what is our apraraga? What is our uncommon, rare, on the margins song, and what might happen if we let that in. Rumi also talks about what happens. He says it's a disastrous surrender and a fine love together. A disastrous surrender and a fine love together. Are we allowing a disastrous surrender so that fine love can come in? The door is round and open, and people are going back and forth across the windowsill where the two worlds meet. What are the notes that are jostling at the wings of your consciousness, personally and as a community?